What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a concept which is signaled by the acronym MAD or MAD. And the acronym stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. On face value, it's not actually a poker concept. It's more to do with military strategy. But it's a concept that can be applied to poker. And while it's a concept that exists on a fairly subtle level, it has the potential to completely change the way that we think about the game. Let's start off with the concept origins. And it's based around the theory of rational deterrence, which interestingly has links to Nash equilibrium and game theory. It's based around the idea that if we have two countries with nuclear capabilities, let's call them country A and country B, neither of them is incentivized to wipe out the other country using their nuclear capabilities. And that's because the second country will always have what's referred to in military terms as second strike ability. So country A fires all of its nuclear weapons at country B retaliates. The end result is a complete mutual destruction of both actors in this scenario. The reason why this is related to Nash equilibrium and game theory is the idea that so long as both countries have nuclear capabilities, both are incentivized to not act, because by acting, they're also assuring their own destruction in the process. Of course, out of those two countries, neither are incentivized to deactivate their nuclear capabilities either, because all of a sudden that Nash equilibrium is no longer in place. If country A gets rid of its nuclear capabilities, country B has the ability to launch a nuclear attack against country A, safe in the knowledge that country A has no ability to retaliate. So that MAD, or mutually assured destruction, no longer exists. A similar situation exists in poker. Of course, the gravity is nowhere near as significant or serious as a nuclear conflict between two countries, but hopefully you'll see the similarities and why we describe the corresponding poker scenario also using the acronym MAD. We're going to illustrate this using a thought experiment. So imagine yourself in this situation. It's a poker game, it's heads up on the river, and there is $100 in the middle. Now, this is a little bit of an unusual poker game, and often thought experiments do make use of extreme parameters. So the extreme parameter here is that although there's only $100 in the middle, there's $1 million in the remaining effective stacks. So both us and our opponent have $1 million remaining in the effective stacks. Now we look down at the board and we see that the board texture reads 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace, no flush possible. What that means is, without seeing our opponent's cards, we're familiar with this. If we're Hold'em players, we know that the pot is definitely going to be a chop, because currently both players will play board, which is the stone cold nuts, the ace high straight, and it's not physically possible to make a stronger hand than that. So we know we're going to chop, and let's just say for argument's sake that this particular game has fairly low rake, only 1% rake, but in this case it's uncapped. So there's not an upper limit on the amount of rake we may have to pay to the poker room. Now let's just imagine we're in position, our opponent checks to us, and I'm going to give you two options for potentially being the best play. Now of course there are a whole range of different options in the middle, but let's just keep this very simple and say you have two options and you need to pick between these two options. Which one would you choose? Option A is we can check back, and obviously that $100 in the middle is going to be chopped up between us and our opponent. Or we can take option B, which is shove all in for $1 million. Now, if you have experience playing in this type of situation, you'll know that the majority of good players just check down, right? Because we know that it's going to be a chop, and we kind of assume that our opponent probably knows that as well. So if we bet, he's just going to call, and we'd end up paying extra rake. So normally it's considered a bad thing to bet in a situation where the board is going to force both players to chop at showdown. But let's just think about that other scenario for a minute. Let's think about the situation where we bet all in for $1 million. And let's put ourselves in our opponent's shoes. So imagine we're facing this all-in $1 million bet on the river into $100 in the pot. What is the correct play? The correct play in that situation is to fold. And the reason is we have to factor in rake costs. Yes, we know we're going to chop, but if we call, the pot is going to be just over $1 million. That means the rake cost is going to be around $10,000 paid to the poker room. And that's going to come out of both of our stacks. It's going to be $5,000 from our stack and $5,000 from our opponent's stack. So as you can see, folding is 0 EV, but calling against the $1 million river bet is a huge minus EV option. So if our opponent is forced to fold against the $1 million bet, doesn't that suddenly mean that the $1 million bet is now the best option? Well, kind of, but there's a bit of a problem. You see, it really depends on how vindictive the defender is in this scenario. You see, when we're facing that $1 million bet, we know that if we fold, our opponent picks up the $100 pot that's in the middle. But it's also as if he's not really entitled to it because everyone at the table knows that it's a situation where we should chop. So if we were feeling vindictive, a bit spiteful, we could make the call. It would cost us $5,000 in rake, roughly, but we'd have the satisfaction of knowing that our opponent also has to pay $5,000 rake to the poker room. In other words, we can't win in this situation, but we can prevent our opponent from winning if we're also willing to make a sacrifice. And hence, we loop back around to the concept of mutually assured destruction. Making that large river bet is very risky because although technically our opponent should fold, we're also giving him the keys to do us a lot of damage. Now, that's a fairly far-fetched thought experiment to illustrate how the concept of MAD applies to poker. Let's consider a slightly less far-fetched thought experiment. And this is something that's going to occur day in and day out. And part of the intention of this podcast is to help you see the relevance of this scenario and understand how to adjust. So imagine we are playing in a game where the rake costs are around 10 big blinds per 100 hands. Now, if you are a high-stakes online player, you won't be paying 10 big blinds per 100 hands generally. However, if you are a low-limit online player, you may be paying 10 big blinds per 100 hands. Or if you are a live player, you may be paying 10 big blinds per 100 hands or more, and you might even factor in any tips that you ship to the dealer as part of your rake costs. The point is, it's not free to play. Let's just say for this thought experiment that our costs are 10 big blinds per 100 hands. And let's say versus a specific opponent at our table, we have 5 big blinds per 100 hands win rate differential. In other words, we are 5 big blinds better per 100 than our opponent. In fact, to keep this really simple, let's just pretend we're playing heads up against this particular opponent. So we are beating our opponent at a clip of 5 big blinds per 100 hands pre-rake. After we pay our 10 big blinds per 100 hands to the poker room, all of a sudden we're actually losing against our opponent at a win rate of -5 big blinds per 100 hands. So we are 5 big blinds per 100 better than our opponent, but due to rake costs, we're losing at -5 big blinds per 100 hands. We can deduce that our opponent must be losing at -15 big blinds per 100 hands, because he's losing at a win rate of -5 BB per 100 against us, but he's also paying 10 big blinds per 100 to the room. So his overall win rate after rake is -15 BB per 100 hands. What is the end result of this scenario? This is another type of mutually assured destruction. And an interesting takeaway here is, it's not necessarily about being better than your opponent. This is not necessarily an ego war where we say, I'm much better than this guy, I can win at 5 big blinds per 100 against him. That's not what this game is about. You can see in this situation, we have an edge against our opponent. We're better than our opponent, but the end result is still mutually assured destruction. Our objective is not just to be better than our opponent, it's to make money. And you can see in this context that not only do we have to beat our opponent, but we have to beat our opponent by enough of a clip that we're also covering our rate costs. Now, to get a feel for how this looks in practice, mutually assured destruction scenarios, like the two thought experiments we've considered, are especially likely to arise in the following scenarios. One example would be our opponent is playing a very aggressive style with large bet sizings. So he's 3-betting to a very large sizing pre-flop. He's c-betting a lot. He's making use of large sizings. Now, if we were to break down our opponent's strategy, perhaps using a GTO solver, for example, we might find a number of situations where technically our opponent is out of line. But let's just say he's not a terrible opponent. Let's say he's not splashing chips all over the table. Yes, he's kind of out of line, but he's doing so in a relatively skilled way. It's not super easy to counter our opponent. And this is often the case if you are facing a lot of aggression, you're facing large 3-bet sizings, large bet sizings post-flop, including overbets. These types of strategy are usually fairly difficult to counter. And what ends up happening is, if we do counter these very aggro strategies, we often find ourselves in fairly marginal EV territory, but the rate costs are very high because there are large amounts of chips traveling across the table every hand. This is a more realistic or practical example of our initial thought experiment. We can easily find ourselves in a situation where technically villain's out of line, and we've got two options. We can either let our opponent win in those specific situations. So think about our opponent's making that $1 million bet on the river into the chopped pot. It kind of sucks to fold in that situation. We feel like we are letting our opponent win. And in some ways we are. We're just letting him pick up that $100 pot uncontested. But what is the alternative? The alternative is to counter, and sure, we'll have the satisfaction of knowing that our opponent's strategies, which aren't necessarily very good theoretically, are not working out, but the end result is going to be a mutually assured destruction scenario. The end result is both of us are going to lose to the rake. Sometimes this idea is expressed using the term zero-sum game. So the idea behind a zero-sum game is anytime one player loses a certain amount, that amount is transferred directly to that player's opponent or another player in the game. So the end result is the total amount of points or chips, depending on the game, is completely preserved. Now, it might sound on surface value like poker is a zero-sum game. For example, if I lose $100 against my opponent, then my opponent gets those $100 in his stack, but not quite. Because if I lose $100, my opponent doesn't quite get $100. He gets less than that. Perhaps he gets $95. It depends how much the poker room takes in rate costs. So poker is not a zero-sum game. And this explains why our opponent could potentially do something which is theoretically incorrect in a certain situation, but still leave us in a situation where we don't have the ability to profitably counter that. Because although we can sometimes prevent our opponent from making money, there's always an associated rate cost with that counter strategy, and we have to ensure that our decisions are profitable overall. So another way of thinking about that is very simply, just because our opponent is losing doesn't necessarily mean that we're winning. Our opponent could be losing, and we could also be losing at the same time in the same hand, and the only winner ends up being the poker room as a result of the rate costs. So hopefully you can see why it may, in some cases, be correct to fold in situations where defending is theoretically correct. Now, that might seem a little bit strange. Why would we ever fold in a situation where it's theoretically correct to defend? After all, if we think about a solver, for example, a solver factors in rate costs, right? And a solver is still going to fold. If the solver sees that it's minus EV after rake, the solver is capable of making the fold. So surely good theoretical play actually factors in rake. And that's certainly true to a large extent. But think about the overall picture for a minute. Let's imagine we have two perfect GTO robots playing a heads-up match, and the poker room is taking 10 big blinds per 100 hands in rake. What's going to happen to those solver bots? Are they going to break even? In some senses, they will break even against each other because their win rate is going to be the same. So if you imagine, for example, that if they were to play in a zero rake environment, their win rate would be 0 big blinds per 100 hands against each other over an infinite sample. But put those same two solver bots in an environment where they have to pay 10 big blinds per 100 hands, their overall win rate is going to be minus 10 big blinds per 100 hands. In other words, just because they're GTO bots doesn't mean they are immune to the effects of mutually assured destruction. And of course, they don't care because they're bots. Their only job is to find a Nash equilibrium regardless of the environment that they're placed in. But as human players, we have slightly different concerns. We need to make money overall as poker players. And that means we need to actively avoid situations where a mutually assured destruction scenario is generated. So the question is, what does that look like in practice? How can we avoid MAD scenarios? Here are some pointers. The first is to keep stack to pot ratios high in order to maximize skill edge. The really simple principle at work here is that the more chips there are for post-flop play, the more that favors the player with the skill advantage. If we think about stacking off pre-flop against a recreational player, for example, even if we are much better than our recreational opponent, our win rate is simply going to be a function of the amount of equity we have. In some senses, our skill edge doesn't even matter after the chips have gone in. If we can instead wait for situations where we have a large amount of equity, then get the chips in, it means our overall win rate is going to be higher. If we are routinely building large pots with marginal equity, it means our EV will also be marginal, but our rate costs will be high. If we are able, as an exploit, to keep the pot relatively small until our equity is high, it means we can keep our rate costs very small while still maintaining a high win rate. Often an even higher win rate than if we'd played a very high variance strategy with lots of big pots. Often when the chips go in pre-flop, for example, equities run a lot closer. Whereas there are many situations post-flop where we can get our entire stack in with our opponent drawing close to dead. These are the kinds of situations that we like. Now, poker doesn't quite work like this in theory. In theory, we actually have to play quite a bit more aggressively than this. For example, in theory, we are supposed to make very large 3-bets pre-flop. We are supposed to triple barrel at a relatively high frequency. But that's theory, and remember, even those theory bots will happily battle it out in a high-rake environment in a mutually assured destruction scenario. This is the difference between a GTO bot and a human player. Exploitatively, we may need to avoid unnecessary aggression. If something is very close but high variance, once again, it means the EV is going to be marginal, but the rate costs are going to be high. And remember, just because it's plus EV in theory doesn't mean it's guaranteed to be plus EV after we have paid rate costs. One thing that's fairly popular amongst high-stakes regs at the moment is a very aggressive 3-bet strategy pre-flop with very aggressive post-flop triple barreling. So a lot of 3-betting followed by bet, bet, bet post-flop. And in many games this appears to work. It's a fairly dangerous approach in the sense that it's a little bit like making that $1 million river bet. So long as our opponent folds, it's fine. but we are actually giving our opponent the keys to do us some damage. Because if our strategy is overly aggressive, it may not be viable from a theory point of view. There will be a counter, and although the counter strategy won't necessarily make the defender any money, it can result in a mutually assured destruction scenario. So the very aggressive 3-bets and triple barrels post-flop can potentially result in a mutually assured destruction scenario for both the aggressor and the defender. So although it tends towards working out, so long as our opponents continue folding, as you can imagine, it's a fairly dangerous scenario. If we can instead avoid unnecessary aggression, so avoid building pots in situations where the EV is very close, once again, this allows us to keep our rate costs low. And hopefully avoid any mutually assured destruction scenario as a result. The final takeaway here is that specific types of opponents are not targets. If our edge is very close against another player at the table, and this is even if we're better than that player, if we know that we're slightly better than our opponent, that doesn't mean our objective should be to battle it out against that player to prove that we're a better player. Because when two players are fairly close in skill level, unless we're talking about very high stakes, low rake environment, the end result may potentially be both players losing to the rake. Yes, we won't lose as fast as our opponent because there's that win rate differential. We're slightly better than our opponent. But remember, we said we don't just need to be better than our opponents. We need to win by enough of a clip to also beat the rate costs imposed on us by the poker room. Okay, so that's MAD, or mutually assured destruction, as applied to poker. If you're interested in the military applications of the concept, you can check out the Wikipedia article on mutual assured destruction without the ly after mutual. I don't really hear any other poker coaches talk about this. I guess I'm potentially the only one who's applied this to poker in this situation. But regardless of what we name the concept, it does exist in the poker universe, and it's definitely something that's worth thinking about when at the poker tables. It's not just about making the right decision. Ultimately, it's about making decisions that generate profit for us as players. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.